Today, we're going to be speaking with Emily Broad Leib, who is a clinical professor of law and faculty director for Harvard Law School's Food Law and Policy Clinic. It's so great having you on today, Emily. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. I'm so glad to be here.
So, let's just start with a little history. Many of us are familiar with food labels in general and also expiration dates, best by, sell by, etc. What's the sort of history of that? When did it start? Why did it start?
Mm-hmm. So we see kind of this modern landscape of, these labels on most food products really taking shape in the 70s. And at that time, it was really consumers were pushing companies and saying that they wanted to know about the freshness of their products. So if you think about where we were at that time, it was sort of starting after like post World War II. People are getting more, further away from where their food is produced, buying more things in the grocery store. And, people said, if I'm not part of the farm and getting it directly from a farm, how will I know how fresh it is?
Right.
And that's when we saw a lot of activity in terms of voluntary use of these labels on the part of companies.
Now, there was also in that period of time, in like the 20 years preceding the 70s, there was a move away from most of the things at the grocery store are ingredients to really like the food product, right? Something that's manufactured and sent. And is that also part of why we started to see those markings that like with a banana, by looking at it, you can mostly tell what is the status of this banana, whereas with some of these products, it might be less clear?
Yeah, that's totally right. So, and I think even today fast forward to now where there's labels on lots of products, a lot of states require them, but it's primarily on packaged foods because I think there's a sense that a banana, an apple, a food that you can pick up and hold and that's sort of in its raw form, that people can really make their own judgments about how fresh it is and how close it is to being spoiled. And it's really packaged foods that you see these labels on because people don't really know. They can't open it up in the store and smell it and
Right.
taste it.
So there's best if used by, there's sell by, there's a straight up expiration date that sometimes is there. These things presumably mean different things, right?
One would think, actually, that's one of the biggest issues is that consumers sort of look at them and think, these labels must be telling me different things. But in fact, there's no law that really regulates what those different terms mean. There's no law defining sell by as compared to use by or expires on right now. In fact, there's no federal law regulating date labels at all. So the federal government, with the very small exception of infant formula, has not required anything. And then in the states that have requirements, they use them very interchangeably. So I think that's one of the places where we got really interested because consumers are misled. Like they think that they're seeing two different labels and that they mean something different, but there's not any evidence that that's the case right now.
Wow. So if I see, as the common man, if I see sell by, it suggests to me it should be sold by that date, but it's still pretty good for some period of time beyond that. Best if used by says it should, to me, it should be consumed by that day. But you're saying that there's not actually an infrastructure that guarantees that that's what I'm being told.
Yeah, that's totally right. And, as we talk about how this can be fixed, I do think there is a piece of drawing on what consumers think that they're reading and, reducing the number of labels and really drawing on like what consumers already are understanding, but just making that the case so that consumers aren't being confused about it.
With something like, when I first really started thinking about the value of some of these labels is when I saw, for example, an expiration date on salt. And, when we think about salt, it's like salt's been around for millions of years. It's just sort of naturally occurring. What does it mean if salt expires? Does that have any meaning at all? Why does salt expire?
Right. I agree with you. Same vinegar. Similarly, it's already turned vinegar. Now it is vinegar. It's not going into some other thing. Bottled water, and I think people are trying to like deal with this cognitive dissonance by making up some reason that the label. So I hear people say a lot, oh, the label on bottled water is like when the plastic is going to leach into the water. I mean, that is not happening. Or if it is, the date is not the date at which that happens. I think you're right that there are a lot of food products that it doesn't seem very clear why a date label would be needed on them, except that consumers have just come to expect them on so many products. And, I've actually talked to people who have said, when I pick something up at the store that doesn't have a date label on it, I'm not sure what to do. So, again, I think in some of our early work, we thought, well, maybe we should just remove the label on foods where it's really meaningless. And I think that gets we get a lot of pushback from consumer groups on that. So we're really thinking, how can we take what we have and make it work better and make it align better and be less misleading? Knowing that in some cases we are where we are and we can't kind of completely overhaul the system.
If we want to apply like a corporate profit motive to this, one could imagine you could have foods that are safe for much longer than the dates say, but maybe the manufacturer is worried there could be reputational damage because it might not taste quite as good or whatever the case may be. How much of that is a factor in these labels?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's a really big factor, especially, if you think about where we are right now, which is some states require dates on certain foods. There's quite a huge variation in what foods states require labels on, and then what you can do after the label. So that leaves a lot up to the manufacturer as far as like what words to use, the science, or if there is any science behind how they're setting that date. And of course, for companies, they want you to eat their food when it's going to taste the best.
Right.
So even more cynical version that people say a lot is, is it that they just want you to throw it away and buy more? And I don't think there's necessarily evidence of that, but there is evidence, and companies would say this outright, that they want to set a label when their product they think will taste the best. And they want to leave some wiggle room for the fact that you might not put your yogurt in the refrigerator right away. And that, so they're kind of being conservative even in that date that they're setting.
When it comes to food waste, we've talked for so long on this program about you got a portion of food that is just wasted on the field, so to speak. It already is sort of like by the time it would get to the supermarket, it might not look so good. So you lose some there. You lose food due to spoilage, and you lose food due to expiration dates. And a question that's often asked is, shouldn't that all be donated somewhere? And one of the reasons that's sometimes given for why it's not is, if you donate stuff to a food pantry beyond the expiration date, one, are you sending the message that people who need to go to a food pantry are deserving of expired food, right? And sort of like the PR issue with that. But also the concern of if someone gets sick and it's beyond an expiration date, is the donor potentially legally liable? So are there other ways in which this is actually preventing dealing with an issue like hunger?
Yeah. I think you're spot on. I would say, as far as the first point, this sort of stigma point about, is this bad food? Are we essentially saying like we're going to give bad food to people,
right,
that are accepting donated food? On that piece, what our approach has been is to say, if you really standardize the labels to have one label that's really clearly about food, the small handful of foods that actually increase in risk after the date, then everyone can be clear in their own households. And then we wouldn't donate those foods. We shouldn't be donating anything that actually is riskier after the date. And then if you have a separate standard label that's really telling people, for all of these foods, you can keep eating it as long as it smells okay, tastes okay. This is just totally an estimate of freshness. Then I would say, those should be able to be sold. They should be able to be donated. People should feel free to use them. People should swap them, whatever it is. So I think, to me, a law that says that they only can be donated but not sold wouldn't make sense, because it would increase that stigma. And I'll say one, peer country that's done a really nice job of this is the UK, where they have use by as the standard label on food that becomes riskier after the date. Best before is the standard label on food that is labeled just for freshness. And then they've done actual campaigns with consumers. They had one earlier this year that was like, look, smell, taste, don't waste. And the whole campaign was really to let people know, if you see best before labels on it, there's no scientific way to make those accurate, and there's no risk after the date. It's really just about your preference and your palate. And then they make it very clear those can be donated, they can be sold at a discount, you can still eat them, you can still serve them, no one's going to get sick. So I think, again, there's like a very clear roadmap for how we could improve on this. And and in a way that makes it not just for, for donation and giveaway, but also for everyone to save dollars.
There's a whole other kind of category of food labels. These include certified organic, all natural, no preservatives, no added sugar, whole grains only. We could kind of go down the list, and different ones mean different things. Are any of these, other than organic, actually regulated terms in any way that have a set meaning every time they are used?
So it's a hard question because there's truly so many of those labels.
Yeah.
Are as like what so to speak eco labels like organic that really relate to like the way that they're grown and produced in the environmental side. Organic is the only one. There was legislation passed around bioengineered label, which would be foods that are genetically modified, being labeled, that will also be regulated. On the health side, there are some that are regulated. For example, if you want to say that a food is healthy or low in sugar, there are some, but there are also a lot that aren't that heavily regulated. So on that side, it sort of depends on the label. But I should say, a lot of those fall to the Food and Drug Administration to enforce. And like there's thousands and thousands of products with thousands and thousands of labels. And I think most people in this space, present party included, would say that, there might be labels on there that aren't actually being enforced because FDA just doesn't have the capacity to get to all of them and make sure that they're.
At one point, there was this heart healthy label, which many of us would be familiar from oats, Quaker oats. But it was basically, if I recall correctly, at least in its initial version, based on the amount of fat. And so you had very strange products, including at one point, I think it was like the equivalent of some kind of fruit roll-up type candy, which I think qualified for the label based on its absence of fat, but it's not really something that we would think. I mean, it's a highly processed, it's candy essentially. Yeah. And so it was like this, what does this really mean, right?
Right. No, I think you're right. And I think this has been a critique of a lot of those labels, healthy, heart healthy, low fat, whatever. There are disqualifying levels of other nutrients, but sugar, which really people weren't as worried about in the, in the 80s when a lot of these labeling and early 90s. So now you have these bizarre outcomes where there's like no disqualifying level of sugar for all of these health related claims. I think this is something that FDA has been supposedly working on. Hopefully we'll, get around to really updating some of those labels because I think they are really misleading for consumers. And I think today sugar is really one of the most concerning ingredients in products in terms of just the, where we are as a country.
So what are on sugar labeling? Like, what are some of the issues? It seems, some that come to me off the top of my head is sometimes it will say no sugar, but it has various syrups, which are, arguably not different than sugar from a health standpoint. Sometimes you will see things like sweetened with beet sugar, as if that's really different than cane sugar or regular sugar when it's unclear there really is a difference, right? I mean, it seems sort of like the gluten-free label on an apple, where it's like, yes, it's gluten-free, but is that really actionable and relevant in any way?
Yes, totally agree. Evaporated cane sugar. Evaporated cane syrup is one you will see. And I still see it. And I think, FDA said it's not allowed. Again, they don't have the capacity to enforce all of them. So consumers pay the price of that. And I think that there's both responsibility on the part of the FDA and potentially on Congress to really beef up the resources so that those can be enforced. Evaporated cane syrup is literally sugar. It is what everyone would think of as sugar. And yet, again, it will say no sugar and it will have that on a product. And yeah.
Two other specific ones that I want to ask about. So organic is actually a regulated term with a specific meaning about the how it's grown or whatever. When it comes to all natural, what is important for people to understand about whether all natural has any meaning whatsoever?
Great question. No one can answer that question because there's no definition really from the Food and Drug Administration for all natural. So there's been a huge amount of litigation, particularly in California, which has really nice laws that are very supportive towards consumers. just a flood of litigation around a product with an all natural claim, and then plaintiffs, consumers saying that they bought the product and then realized afterwards there were certain processing elements, or it was ultra processed, or it included, gene edited or, genetically engineered materials that people would think don't seem natural. There's I would say for now, I treat that claim as if I just ignore it completely. I would say that is meaningless at the moment. And I think, again, there's a big question mark as to if and when we will see the FDA come out with a real definition that can give consumers a little more confidence in that claim.
Last thing I want to ask about, and I know we're now getting a couple levels removed from where we started. Homeopathic products, herbal products, some supplements, etc., where they say statements have not been evaluated by the FDA, etc. We've all seen that type of thing. What are the concerns and sort of what is in that general space that consumers should be aware of when looking at those products?
Now you're a couple steps from my bailiwick. They're even, I've always said already that there's a lot of claims on foods that either FDA hasn't yet defined, like natural, they don't really have a great definition, or where there is a very clear definition, but they just don't have the resources to enforce. Once you get into supplements, herbal things, et cetera, it's even more so that way. I mean, a lot of people in the food space will call that really the Wild West in terms of the level of both laws and enforcement. So I think it's a really difficult area. I think there's a lot of folks calling for more regulation there, making sure both that there's really two concerns. One is when you buy a supplement, is what's in there actually what it says it is?
Right.
And the second is, are the claims about what it can do for your health validated in any way? And I think on both ends of that, it's a really big question mark. And it's hard for the companies that are, trying to do it well and trying to do a good job, because I think they would probably like more enforcement so that they, that people will have more trust in that space.
Yeah, without a doubt. Emily Broad Leib is a clinical professor of law and faculty director for Harvard Law School's Food, Law, and Policy Clinic. Really appreciate your time today.
Great talking to you. Thanks.